Hugo Vlad's banner is just around the corner, but we've actually already got his full kit shown off. Not only that, but everyone has also had a chance to even test Hugo out. But it's only a one-time thing where you get to use a trial version of Hugo within the patch 1.7 story, and it's quite easy to miss some of the details of his kit as well as just how good it could be, since this trial version of Hugo isn't exactly the greatest thing. Unfortunately, this is a one-time trial and you can't really go back to look at things. So this video will be going in depth into Hugo's kit, showing off just how crazy some of his multipliers are and how strong Hugo can be, but at the same time also why it might not be worth pulling for Hugo at all, even despite how strong his kit may seem. Let's start off with his kit though. At first glance, Hugo's kit is rather simple when it comes to actually playing him. Like many other attackers, it's just going to be a case of mashing your attack buttons. There aren't really any special gauges or whatever that you need to keep track of with Hugo, which could be seen as a big plus depending on how you feel about certain attackers. Take for example the other limiteds, where it feels like there's a constant minigame of trying to build up Ellen's stacks or building up Shuyan's bullets, or Haramas's electro quivers, and until you get those built up, you feel like you barely do any damage. Now, to be fair, Hugo is kind of the same in that most of his big damage comes from stunning the enemy, but again, the same could be said for all of the attackers. The one notable thing within Hugo's regular attacks is that during his basic attack combo, the fourth hit has his scythe shoot a charged shot very Ruby Rose style, and you can do this charged shot by holding down the attack button. But a lot of Hugo's other attacks shortcut directly to this fourth hit. For example, after a dodge counter, an EX special attack, or a quick assist, Hugo will immediately go into his fourth hit of the basic attack string, where by charging up the shot, it will deal double damage as well as double daze. Otherwise, like I mentioned, his attacks are very simple and straightforward. No fancy gauges, his EX special just does a burst of damage, as do the rest of his chain attacks and whatnot. However, all of the complexity and big numbers come in the form of his core skill. By far, one of the longest worded core skills in the game. As you might already know, Hugo really thrives on stunning enemies quickly and often, and the reason why is all thanks to this core skill. Now, there are essentially 5 different aspects of this core passive, so let's go bit by bit. Starting with the first one. When a chain attack hits an enemy or when Hugo stuns an enemy, Hugo will gain the Dark Abyss reverb state for 6 seconds, which increases his crit rate by 12% and crit damage by 25%. Now, 6 seconds may not seem like a lot, but Hugo can do a lot within those 6 seconds. As mentioned, Hugo really likes enemies getting stunned, so the second part of his passive is that when there is one stun agent in the team, Hugo gets a 300-point attack increase, and if there are 2 stunners, he gets a 900-point attack increase instead when at core skill F. The next part of his passive is quite lengthy, so bear with me. When Hugo's EX special or his ultimate attack hits a stunned enemy, it triggers the new Totalize effect. This Totalize effect increases the damage multiplier of the skill by 1000%. Now, I'm emphasizing the fact that this Totalize is not damage itself. So it is not like, say, a Disorder or a Vivian a Bloom effect. This Totalize is altering the multiplier of the EX or ultimate attack. So for anyone wondering, can this Totalize damage crit? It's not a separate instance of damage. It is increasing the multiplier of the attack that is already being used. So of course, the EX and ultimate can crit naturally, and so this 1000% damage multiplier is then taken a part of the regular crit calculation. This is going to be very important, but first, let's go over the rest of the Totalize effect. That 1000 point multiplier increase is simply a baseline. Depending on how much time is left in the stun window for the enemy, this multiplier value is increased even further. If there are 5 seconds or less left within the stun window, each second remaining of the stun window will increase the damage multiplier by 280% per second. However, if there are more than 5 seconds left, then for every second between 5 and 15 seconds, the damage multiplier is increased by a further 100% per second. The maximum total multiplier that Totalize can add to the attack is 3400%. Think of that as your main number, 3400% at core skill F. This is when there is at least 15 seconds left on the stun window. The description does make it seem kind of confusing with the whole numbers per second, so just know that the more time is left, the bigger the multiplier, and that you really want to have at least 5 seconds left to get the most bang for your buck. Then, when this Totalize effect is triggered, the enemy will immediately come out of the stunned state. This is why I said that the 6-second crit increase may seem short, but realistically, you'll have done most of your damage within that window already. But, depending on how much time was left in the stun window, the enemy will automatically have a certain amount of days applied to them, with 5% days applied per second left in the window, with a maximum of 25%. So again, you really want to make sure that you have a minimum of 5 seconds left of the stun window when you trigger Totalize, so that you can get the most days applied to the enemy and a lot of the damage multiplier applied. And then lastly, just to help Hugo stun enemies even more, his EX special also has an increased 20% days against non-stunned enemies. And then, as for Hugo's team passive, if another teammate is a stun or an ice agent, Hugo's chain attack just straight up does 15% more damage. And actually, it'll do 50% more damage against non-boss enemies. And as if Totalize wasn't strong enough already, the resulting damage dealt by the skill is also just straight up increased by 40%. And using the EX special on non-bosses also refunds 20 energy to help you blitz through that first wave of enemies in a Shiyu defense stage. So yes, his regular attacks may be pretty simple, but that's because it's all about getting them stunned to trigger that Totalize effect. Which, let me put that into perspective if it didn't seem crazy enough yet. Say you have Hugo's ultimate at level 9. It has a damage multiplier of 2638%. Okay. But at core skill F, if the enemy is stunned with at least 15 seconds left, this multiplier will then be increased by 3400%, up to a total of a 6000% damage multiplier. Or if you are using the EX skill, the 645 multiplier goes up to 4000%. But that is just the skill multiplier. Don't forget that these attacks can still crit. So imagine you have, say, 200% crit damage on top of this huge multiplier. Now you're doing double of that damage. And then obviously the enemy has to be stunned. So now the damage is further multiplied by at least 150%. Let's say you have Lighter and Lycaon as your two stunners. The stun multiplier is then increased by another 35%. And then the enemy also has their ice resistances decreased, as well as Hugo having his ice damage increased. And then, thanks to Hugo's team passive, the damage dealt by the skill all in all, after all of this, is still further increased by 40% as well. And then, if after all of this, the enemy is still somehow alive, they are already 25% of the way to being stunned again and having you smack them with a second orbital nuke for another time. Now, all of that being said, yes, Hugo is very likely going to be incredibly strong. But as for whether or not you should pull for him, well, there are actually quite a few things working against Hugo, sadly. The first is his team composition. As mentioned, technically speaking, Hugo wants 2 other stunners in his team to get the sweet 900 attack point boost, which honestly is pretty good. It might finally give people a reason to not just slap a supporter like Astra everywhere, because with 2 stunners, it's kind of like you're getting that attack buff anyway. And the stunners are still supporting Hugo by ideally getting stuns non-stop. The issue is that if you are somewhat a newer player who may not have a lot of the premium limited S-rank stunners, things start to get a bit rough. Now, there are of course the standard agents. For example, Lycaon, who is of course going to be great with Hugo, and still Collider, who could also be good, but maybe not as great as Lighter. And then there are the A-rank agents, Anbi and Pulchra, who, I mean, the fact that Pulchra is an off-fielder, maybe with their powers combined, Pulchra and Anbi can still help stun the enemy relatively quickly for Hugo, but it's kind of hard to say from the limited trial versions that we've had. And Hugo is really going to live and die by how quickly you can get those stuns off. In contrast, I'd like to highlight Vivian, who, although she isn't really the main DPS herself, in my eyes, Vivian is a lot more new player friendly. Because while yes, you can pair Vivian with some of the S-rank anomaly agents to do really well, Vivian has an incredibly potent A-rank team with Piper and Lucy. Albeit though that you do need some mindscapes on both Piper and Lucy, but still, it's a lot easier than to say, if you want to make Hugo good, you need to make sure you have Lycaon and Lighter as well. I'm just really hoping that this isn't the case where Hugo is only good if you have X and Y, right? The next point of concern is with regards to disc sets. Hugo suffers from the same fate of Lighter, Harumasa, and Evelyn, where there isn't really a disc set tailor-made for him. The same way that stuff like Phaethon's Melody is made specifically for Vivian, or Astral Voice is made specifically for Astra. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing, but it just means that it kind of feels like you sort of just have to deal with whatever you're given, right? Wouldn't it be great if there was a disc set made specifically for Hugo where it's like it increases the impact so you can stun enemies quicker, but then it also increases a bunch of crit damage and ice as well once they are stunned. It sort of feels like you're using Hugo without his signature engine, right? But instead of signature engine, it's like a signature disc set. On the bright side though, things could change in the future. I did mention Harumasa earlier, but to be fair, later on, the Shadow Harmony set did end up becoming great for Harumasa as well. So maybe the same could be said for Hugo. And then the last point, and I think the one that I'm sure everyone probably saw coming, was with the other banners coming up. Like I said, if you're looking for a meta character with big DPS who can help you carry you through content, then yes, I'm sure Hugo can be that. But at the same time, there's a good chance that Yi Xuan on the next patch cycle could be all of that and more. And not only that, but as an ice DPS specifically, there is a lot of competition. If Miyabi ever gets a rerun, Hugo's role could be in jeopardy. And in fact, even ignoring Void Hunters, even Ellen, the other ice attacker, could be giving a Hugo a run for his money. Even though she recently had a rerun earlier this year, since the devs mentioned going back and updating some of the older agents' kits, Ellen is probably going to get a touch-up at some point in the future. Now, whether or not this touch-up will end up making her become way stronger than Hugo, or at least just on par with him, that we will just have to wait and see. But all in all, I don't think that Hugo is a bad character at all. The simplicity in his kit while still being able to hit ridiculous multipliers is very nice. And honestly, I kind of welcome the emphasis on trying to use Hugo alongside 2 stunners. In fact, who knows, maybe one of the upcoming stunners ends up making Hugo absolutely busted. Right now we're only thinking about Hugo alongside Lycaon and Lighter for the hot men team, I guess. But what if Jufufu ends up becoming like his best stunner? Since in the past, it's always seemed like the devs tried to line up agents that pair well together. For example, Lighter was just before Miyabi, Bernice was just before Yanagi, Soldier Ambi was just before Trigger and whatnot. But Hugo doesn't really have synergy with Vivian, who was the banner before him. Although arguably again, maybe they went with the reruns synergizing with the main banners. But all of this being said though, like I mentioned, this was mainly a meta and numbers discussion. If you are in love with Hugo and his character and his personality, or his looks and whatnot, please don't let me stop you from wanting to pull him. So in fact, I'm kind of curious, are you going to pull for Hugo or not? And also, why or why not, I suppose. But otherwise, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.